So good morning, everybody. I'm going to ask that everybody mute themselves, please. And Pam is going to be asking if anybody has any questions or making any comments. And so I've left it so that you guys can unmute yourselves if needed. But if you can mute yourselves for the duration of this, that would be great. Although we're used to being together and having some really great food while we're networking, I'm excited that DART was able to bring this presentation to you. So thank you to the Ministry of Children and Community Social Services. Just a few housekeeping items before I introduce Pam. Again, just keep yourselves on mute throughout the duration. Unless you have a comment, I'm going to ask that those go into the chat, and they are going to be moderated as well too. Pam will give opportunities for questions to be asked throughout. The presentation this morning is going to go from 9:30 to 11:30. That'll be Pam's segment in regards to language matters. And then the Voices of Courage Survivor panel will be presenting from 11:30 until noon. You can keep your camera on if you'd like. We do like to see your faces and some nods to know that you're kind of following along and getting it. So that's great. If you do need to come off camera, no problem. Pam will be building in a break whenever she thinks that it's appropriate at that time. It'll be about a 10-minute break. And then we'll be recording this if there's anybody in the agencies for us to forward it to afterwards as well too. Okay. So it is my honor to introduce Pamela Cross. Pamela is a feminist lawyer, a well-known and respected expert on violence against women and the law for her work as a researcher, writer, educator, and trainer. She works with women's equality and violence against women organizations across Ontario. One of her key roles is a legal director of Luke's Place Support and Resource Center in Durham Region, where she leads the organization's provincial projects, including research, training, and advocacy. I want to welcome Pam. Thanks for being here this morning, Pam.
Thank you so much, Laura, for the invitation. I'm just going to put up my slides, so bear with me because every time it's like a mystery. Can you see them? Yes?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Okay, great. Good morning. Again, I am very happy to be with you today, and I really appreciate the invitation. Let me start by acknowledging the land where I am this morning, from which I'm joining you. That's in Eastern Ontario, in the city known as Kingston. This is Aboriginal land that's been inhabited by Indigenous people since the beginning. In particular, I recognize that this is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Anishinaabeg, and Haudenosaunee peoples, whose presence, along with that of Métis, Inuit, and other First Nations peoples from across Turtle Island, endures here. As a settler, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here, and I thank all the generations of people who've taken care of this land for thousands of years. I make this recognition in clear connection to our collective commitments to acting on the calls to action of the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as well as the calls to justice of the final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. As I said just a minute ago, I'm really happy to be with you today. I'm fortunate. I live in a city that is a pilot for pharmacy rollouts of the vaccine. So I can tell you, I got vaccinated yesterday. Never have I been so excited to have a needle stuck in my arm as I was at 2:20 yesterday. Absolutely no side effects so far. So, 2 thumbs up to AstraZeneca as far as I'm concerned. I want to make this presentation today as interactive as possible, given that we're not, in fact, all sitting in the same room. So as Laura has already said, we're going to use the chat function for discussion. There's too many of you. I can't see all of your faces once we've got the slides up here. And I think it would just be really difficult with more than 80 of you to moderate you speaking unless it's really urgent and you just have to get your voice into the room, and I completely understand that. So please, throughout the presentation, jot your comments, thoughts, questions in chat as they come to you. I'm also at specific times going to pose a question and ask you to use the chat function to comment on that question, and then I'll share that out loud, and we'll try to have some sort of a conversation that way. We also have time at the end for a more structured Q&A time, and maybe then, depending on what questions people post, I might ask you to say your question out loud to the group. We have people monitoring that chat. I can't look at it that often because I'm speaking and looking at slides and what have you. But my colleague Laura, so we have two Lauras at least here this morning, but my colleague Laura, as well as your Laura and your Lynn, are keeping track of what's happening in chat. So we will hear from you, even if it's not in the way we would be able to do if we were all in the room together. This morning, we're going to talk about language and why the words we use to talk about abuse and violence to which women are disproportionately subjected are so important. And as I was listening to Laura introduce me, I was thinking, this really isn't about me as a lawyer talking to you today. Those are my professional credentials, but this isn't a lawyerly talk. It's not a legal talk. It's about words and how words affect attitudes and understandings. And why, as a lawyer, giving you that talk? Not really. It's not really because I'm a lawyer. It's because I've been working on the issue of violence against women for a long time now, as many of you have. And over those years, I've used language differently. The way I use language has evolved as my understanding of violence against women has evolved. But also, as I've seen how often people misunderstand, people who don't do the work that all of us do, misunderstand what gender-based violence is, what violence within families is, and so on. And so over those years of my own learning and listening to other people, I've developed a real interest in thinking about how we can use language as well as possible so that we know what we're talking about, so our colleagues know what we're talking about, so we're respectful to those who are living with violence and who have survived that violence, and so we can engage the public who are relatively uninformed and help them understand the reality of what we're talking about. If we don't name the problem correctly, we will never find the solution to it, I guess is sort of the basis or the premise on which I've done this thinking. Before I start digging into the substance of today's presentation, I want to just tell you briefly about Luke's Place, where I work. I think that helps to contextualize what I'm talking about and also explains why we at Luke's Place use the language we do when we're talking about gender-based violence. As you can see from the slide, Luke's Place is located in Durham region. We provide direct services to women in that geographic area who have left abusive relationships and who are engaged with the family law process. That could be through litigation, that they have a case in court, they might be working with a mediator, or they might be really at the very beginning of their journey and be wondering what it is they need to do if they're going to leave their abuser. We also work at the provincial and national levels, conducting research, developing resources, providing training, and engaging in systemic advocacy. We've listed all three of our websites on the right-hand side of that slide so that you can learn more about us and what we do. The top one, Family Court and Beyond, is our resource, which is available both as a website and in hard format. This is a resource for women who are involved with family court. It provides them with tip sheets, basic legal information, checklists, all kinds of information, as well as places where they can record what's happening with their case. We think it's a fantastic resource. If you're not familiar with it, please take the time to have a look at that website at some point. The middle website is our public website, where you can find a lot of information to support you in the work that you do. And the bottom website is our training site that lists various different trainings that we make available, some to specific groups and other trainings more publicly. I also gave you a link to my own website in case you want to find out more about me at some point, pamelacross.ca, pretty easy to remember. Our direct service work, as I said, is with women who are fleeing abuse. All of our work, whether it's direct service or systemic, uses an intersectional feminist framework. Within that, we acknowledge and respect that men can be and are victims of abuse at the hands of their female partners. Abuse happens in same-sex as well as heterosexual relationships. And folks who identify as trans or non-binary can also face abuse in their intimate relationships. However, all of this abuse is rooted in a power structure that is based on misogyny and traditional forms of male power. And it's people who identify as women who are subjected to the most serious forms, especially of coercive controlling abuse, as well as physical violence, including lethal violence. And that's why we use gendered nouns and pronouns when we talk about violence. And that's what I'll be doing today. I thought we could start by looking at some headlines. And I'm going to begin that by sharing with you a very short clip, less than 2 minutes, from a recent TED Talk done by an Australian journalist named Jane Gilmore. So I'm going to take us to that now and hope that I've done all of my technology correctly. So Laura, I can see you, Laura, Dart Laura. If you can just give me a nod once you can hear the video, the sound of the video, that would be great.
Here's a list of things that don't cause murder. Stiletto heel shoes, mothers, selfies, broken hearts, romance, sex romps. Here's a list of things that do cause murder. The decision to murder someone. Look at this. Bullet just came into this house and killed this daughter and her father, just all by itself. No, of course it didn't. This 16-year-old girl, her ex-boyfriend came into her house with a loaded gun, shot and killed her father, and tried to kill her sister. This is Tara Costigan. A lot of you will have heard of her. Her ex-partner came into her house, brutally murdered her a week after she gave birth to their baby. This is the headline we get. Of course, you don't think that bullets and axes are just randomly going into people's houses and killing them, because murder is a choice, and things can't make choices. But the men who committed these murders, and yes, they were all men, they didn't make these headlines at all. They're invisible. Does it matter? Does it matter that they were all men and that they're not in the headlines? I think it does.
After I watched this video, I decided I would take a look at some Canadian media reports on different instances of gender-based violence. Here's what I found in just a few minutes of hunting around online. So I just want to make a few comments about what you can see on your screen right now. I'm going to start with that really large format piece in the middle. We're not looking for suspects at this time, and there's no threat to public safety. I'm sure all of you have read that in a newspaper article or heard it on a television report, and I'm sure some of you who work with police services are the ones who have said that. It's an absolutely true statement. There's nothing wrong with that statement at all, so that's not why it's up there. But I think it's an interesting place to start looking at how we talk about domestic violence. When I see this particular line in a news story now, I assume it means it's a case of intimate partner violence, probably homicide. And so far, I've always been right. It's kind of code for those of us who do the work. It's a way of saying nobody needs to worry. The threat was contained to this house, to this group of individuals, and the police are not yet in a position to be able to give any other information. But it is, in a way, as I said, a kind of code. A lot of these other comments, they seem to be a normal family, a very nice couple, nice, wonderful people. Where are those comments coming from? Well, they're coming from neighbors usually, and usually when there's been an extremely violent incident of intimate partner abuse, aka domestic homicide. It's remarkable to me how and why the media still think this is something that's worth reporting on. All of you know, as well as I do, because you do this work, that people who are involved in relationships where there is abuse, whether they are the person causing the abuse or the victim of the abuse, don't walk around with some giant sign on their forehead. They don't look different from the rest of us. They're often great neighbors. Many a man who is abusive to his wife shovels the driveway of the elderly couple next door to them, offers to take somebody's garbage out while they're on vacation, might be a choir master or a sports coach or whatever. And yet we continue to see these kinds of quotes in the media when something terrible has happened. Then we hear other things like a violent sexual encounter. That means rape or sexual assault. Why is it being called an encounter? Use of the word encounter really neutralizes what's going on as though it's something that happened between these two people. Nothing happened between these two people. One person sexually assaulted the other. Just as Jane Gilmore discovered, the people causing the harm in each of these stories, except for one, is missing. We don't hear anything in any of these other quotes that tell us one person did a bad thing to another person. The one place where we do hear something about the person who caused harm is in that phrase, promising young man. And that one actually is not something I got out of the newspaper. It's something that I heard when I was sitting in a courtroom listening to a sentencing, a judge issuing a sentence in a sexual assault case. This particular young man had been found guilty of sexually assaulting a fellow student at a university. In fact, they were both law students. And in deciding to give the young man an absolute discharge, the judge said, "This is a very promising young man, and I don't want what has happened here to cause him any difficulties later in his life." Now, I'm sure that sent a pretty strong message to the young woman, as I say, also a law student, about whose promising future was more important to the court. So we have, as Jane Gilmore showed in the little clip I shared with you, and actually that whole talk that she gives is really good. We've given you the link to it. So hopefully you can check out all of it at some point yourself. But just as she has said, and just as I was able to replicate, and honestly, this took me less than 10 minutes to come up with all of these quotes out of newspapers, radio programs, television websites, we have a problem. We don't name what's going on for what it is. And that means that the rest of the world out there doesn't necessarily understand what we need them to understand about the problem we're dealing with or the solutions that we need to look for. Anybody have anything that you want to say at this point, just about what Jane Gilmore had to say or about those few headlines that I put up there for you to look at? Is there anything there that we can comment on? Laura, are you seeing anything? No? Okay. Many of you will remember this story. Mohammed Shamji murdered his wife, Dr. Alana Frick, in 2016. They were both doctors. They had a middle-class lifestyle. And until he murdered her, there was no apparent history of abuse. After the murder, initially, we heard a lot about them based on the images of their relationship that they had shared on Facebook and other social media platforms. That's what the media showed us. Images of the two of them on vacation, images of the two of them with their children, all very heavily curated, I guess I would say, to show this image of a happy family, a happy marriage, suddenly gone wrong. How could this have happened? That's not what really happened in that case. This was a relationship where there had been a long history of abuse. She was struggling with that. She was struggling with what to do about it. Like many women, she had shared her story with a very small group of trusted friends. She was also, in an interesting way, I think, she suffered from the fact that she was a professional. People found it harder to believe that one doctor would abuse another doctor, even in an intimate relationship. So the media showed us these happy pictures and then sort of shrugged their shoulders. How could this have happened? Slowly, the story began to emerge that this wasn't the real picture of what had been happening in the relationship. And suddenly we were looking at a situation where we had all these happy images that really were a lie about what had happened in the relationship. Those stories, the ones the media chose to focus on, told a story of love gone wrong, a crime of passion, neither of which was true. The truth was that Shamji made the decision to kill his wife because she had decided to leave him. She had decided to leave him because he had abused her. But in this case, the bad coverage of the story went even farther than misrepresenting what their relationship had looked like before the murder. You may recall that we saw article after article after article about what a great and accomplished doctor he was, how his patients were going to miss him, how his patients couldn't believe that he could have done something like this. Those stories often eclipsed the stories about her professional achievements. But really, what relevance did his success as a surgeon have to the fact that he had abused and then murdered his wife? None. But that's how the media told the story. That's how the public heard the story. There's no doubt journalists need to do a better job of reporting on gender-based violence. And they definitely need to stop asking neighbors what they think, because we pretty much never learn anything helpful from that. But if that's going to happen, we all have to do a better job when we talk about gender-based violence, whether we're talking to the media, a client, our board of directors, whether we're talking at a staff meeting with our colleagues, or speaking at a conference or a community event. We need to make sure that our language is active and not passive. And I'm going to give examples of all of this over the next little bit. We need to be clear that abuse is unilateral. It's not mutual. We need to call things what they are, and we need to identify the gendered reality of the most serious forms of GBV. Our language needs to reveal and not conceal the violence, clarify and not obscure who's responsible for what. So let's look at some examples of this. And I'm going to start by talking about active versus passive language. I'm old enough that I learned about all of this in elementary school, because grammar actually used to be taught in elementary school. But I'm sure, like me, many of you who did learn this at one point have forgotten much of what we did learn about passive voices and active voices. And some of you may never have had the opportunity to learn grammar. So here's what I mean. If I say, for instance, Brent hit Suzanne, that's active language. Brent, who's the person who did the action, is the subject of the sentence. His name comes first, it comes before the verb. He's the subject. Hit is the verb, that's an active verb. And Suzanne comes at the end. She's the object of the action. It's a strong and clear way to describe what happened and identify who was the active person doing something to the other person who was not active. In other words, it's a straight line, an arrow moving from Brent to Suzanne, from actor to recipient, of the action. Okay, let's say I describe the same situation differently. Suzanne was hit by Brent. That's called simple passive. Don't worry, you're not going to get a test at the end about the grammar, but I want to make the point about how important these differences are. Suzanne, the person to whom the act was done, has now become the subject. The verb is more passive. It doesn't say hit, it says was hit. And Brent, the person who did it, almost disappears at the end of the sentence. I could say it differently again. I could say Suzanne was hit. Now I've made Brent disappear altogether. This is called agentless passive. Suzanne got hit. No actor at all. No arrow from who did it to the person to whom it was done. Or I could say an assault took place. Now they're both gone. We call this normalization. Oh, yep, well, an assault took place, big deal. If we want to make what happened seem mutual, we could say something like there was a domestic dispute. No actors or recipients here, no people named at all, a dispute. That kind of minimizes the seriousness of it. And it really does sound as though it's mutual. Something happened between these two people. Anybody have any thoughts that you'd like to share at this point? I do encourage you to use the chat. You're going to get real tired of my voice if I'm the only one who talks here today. We got anything to look at, Laura?
There is a question here.
Mm-hmm.
It goes back, it says, I have a question. What is the legal definition of a crime of passion?
Well, crime of passion does not exist as a term in the criminal code. So it's not as though you're going to find that term there. What's generally meant by a crime of passion is, let's say I get charged with first-degree murder for having killed, I don't know, somebody who's a friend of mine. And in my defense, my lawyer explains that it was kind of a crime of passion because I had just found out that my friend had, stolen a whole lot of money from me, or was sleeping with my partner, or had harmed my child in some kind of way. That phrase, a crime of passion, is used, and I don't just mean sort of in the media, it can be used in a defense, in a criminal trial, to say this person probably shouldn't have been charged with first-degree murder. Maybe it was second-degree murder, or maybe even manslaughter. So it's a way of saying the person isn't fully responsible for what they did because their passion was so inflamed. It's often used to describe something that happens, where one partner harms another partner, but it could certainly be used in the context I gave, friends, where something just inflames one person's passion to the point that they aren't in full control of the decisions they're making. It's not a bad thing, that phrase. It's not a bad defense, because sometimes, in fact, the person isn't fully responsible for what they've done. My objection to it is when it's used, say, in the context that I gave you a few minutes ago, where that wasn't a crime of passion. This was a man who had been abusive over a number of years to his partner. She had made the decision to leave him. He was not prepared to let her do that. I mean, maybe he was angry, maybe he was passionate, but in my opinion, and the courts agreed, well, not that they asked me, but the courts came to the same conclusion, he was fully responsible for what he did. This wasn't something where he just kind of lost control for a few minutes.
There are two more questions, Pam.
Yep.
As third parties supporting women, we often used alleged abuse. Is this minimizing? Is this proper language?
I'm going to talk about alleged a little bit later this morning, so I'll hold that question till then.
Okay, and there's one more.
Yeah.
I think we feel the need to be neutral in language, and avoiding active language avoids implying judgment.
I understand what you're saying, and I also appreciate that I'm talking to more than 80 people, all of whom have different roles and fit in different places in all of the systems that respond to gender-based violence. However, I would say that if, it depends on your role, but let's say you're a support worker for victims of domestic violence, the client tells you, You know, my husband Brent hit me, Suzanne, yesterday. Certainly, you're not going to get in trouble if you say, in whatever context, writing a report, talking to a colleague. Well, when Suzanne talked to me during intake yesterday, she told me that Brent hit her, right? So you're keeping it in the active, but you're also placing it as what the woman told you. It's not your own opinion about whether this happened or not. Certainly police language is usually pretty direct, and that's helpful. I don't think that simply saying somebody hit somebody or somebody pushed somebody, I don't think you should worry overly about that sounding judgmental, especially if you can contextualize it. Either, you know, I know that Brent hit Suzanne because I watched it happen, or as I suggested a minute ago, Suzanne told me that Brent hit her. It gets pretty confusing as you move down this list that's on this slide. You know, an assault took place isn't helpful to anything, nor is there was a domestic dispute. Susan was hit. If we're talking about something that happens, you know, let's say in a bar, and there's a bit of confusion about who might have hit Suzanne, sure, fair enough, Suzanne got hit. But if we're talking about intimate partner abuse and we know who the two people are, I don't think that it's harmful to be direct and to use active language when we're describing that.
Those are all the questions right now.
Great, thank you. I'm going to show another video clip here in just a second. The volume is fine when I watch this on my own laptop, but when we tested all of this out yesterday, we found the volume was a bit low. So I would encourage you, as I'm stumbling around getting the video up here, that you put your volume up as loud as you can, and then you can turn it back down when it's over. This is a really short clip, less than 2 minutes, from a workshop given a few years ago by Canadian psychologists Linda Coates and Alan Wade. Linda and Alan have done a lot of work on this topic of how we talk about violence against women. At the end of the slide deck, you'll find links to some of their work. If this is stuff that interests you, I really encourage you to take a look at their work, you know, in its full capacity. I'm just pulling a couple of minutes of it out here to share with you today. I'm not the fastest at this stuff.
Abusive relationship is such an interesting one because you see it so commonly used. But yet, the term abusive relationship implies a mutuality there. So if I asked you, are you in a loving relationship? If you said yes, what would that mean? Well, it would mean, yeah, you would be doing loving things, your partner would be doing loving things, you'd be doing loving things together. That's how you build a loving relationship. So if we say abusive relationship, that implies you're being abusive, the other person's being abusive, you're being abusive together. And so it's really important that we clarify terms like that. Who's being abusive to who here?
So if you're talking to someone, and I hear this all the time, someone says, I've been in 2 abusive relationships. I normally wouldn't let that pass in a conversation. Normally I would kind of try to slow it down and say, I'm sorry. Abusive, who's been abusive? Would you mind just, oh, and then you hear, well, my partner's been abusive. So then you can say, okay, so what you're telling me is that you haven't been in 2 abusive relationships at all. Pause for dramatic effect. What you're telling me is, you've been in 2 relationships with people who've been abusive to you. So if you clarify the distinction between mutual and unilateral actions, you do that once, I can tell you it makes a difference. You do that in your publications, your materials, and you do it when rape is described as sex. You begin to tease apart those false descriptions. It begins to clarify who did what to whom, who's responsible for what, and you get a much more accurate description of the events in question.
So I hope that you got what Alan and Linda were getting at there. To describe, and this was a new way of thinking about it for me too, because I have certainly talked about women in abusive relationships many, many times. And I'm now trying to unlearn that language because, as they say here in that little clip, it's not the relationship that's abusive. And it kind of harkens back to Jane's comments about it's not the gun that's the killer. It's not the axe that's the killer. These are acts. These are active acts taken by one person against another. And when we use language like an abusive relationship, we make what is really a unilateral event into something that's mutual, that both these people are just in this kind of relationship. It implies that the victim is at least partially to blame for what's happened, and it hides the fact that violent behavior is unilateral and is the responsibility of the abuser. So, to use some more of Linda and Alan's language, and they're intentionally being a bit lighthearted with their first couple of examples here, car theft is not the same thing as auto sharing. Bank robbery is not a financial transaction. Woman abuse is not an argument, it's not a dispute, and it's not an abusive relationship. It is abuse of the woman by another person. Likewise, if we talk about sexual assault, rape is not sex. And yet we hear that kind of language often used in the media and by members of the public. When a woman submits to being sexually assaulted, that's not consent. She's made a decision that it's safer for her not to fight back. And so the sexual assault is committed against her. That's not consent. Child sexual abuse is not, as it is often described in the media, sex with a minor. That word with, it's just a little word, only 4 letters, but it implies a mutuality. Oh, I had sex with my next door neighbor. Fine, but child sexual abuse is not that. Forced penetration is not sexual intercourse. And sexual assault is not sexual activity. When I'm being sexually assaulted, I am not engaging in sexual activity. An assault is being perpetrated on me or committed against me. Likewise, when a man rapes a woman, they're not having sex. If we think about family violence, and this, I used to say this all the time. Oh, I work with women who've experienced family violence. We see it written down all the time in our work. But think about that. Did she experience it in the same way that maybe I experienced a really great vacation last summer? Or is it more accurate to say a woman whose partner has subjected her to abuse? It's a bit clumsier. It's a longer sentence, but it's not an experience. It's something the woman has been subjected to by the abuser, or to be more accurate, it is something the abuser has subjected her to, is subjecting her to. Active language, with the subject of the sentence being the person who's causing the harm. Of course, part of the challenge, and I've alluded to this already, is that it's quicker and easier to use the wrong language some of the time. For example, and Linda Coates talks about this in that same video that I only let you see a couple of minutes of, and it's actually quite funny the way she talks about it, but I decided I would just summarize it for you here. If in the course of a sexual assault, the perpetrator forces his tongue into the victim's mouth, it's easier to say that he kissed her. And that's often what you'll read, even in some police reports, in the media, etc. But that's not accurate, because when you say he kissed her, it sounds nonviolent. It might even sound consensual or mutual. So we need to say something like, it's very awkward, but he forced his mouth onto hers, or he forced his tongue into her mouth, or whatever similar words reflect what actually happened. And so all of that is just to say that talking accurately about gender-based violence sometimes means we have to use more words, sometimes means our sentences are a little more awkward, but we're conveying more accurately what it is that's going on. And that is that gender-based violence is not a mutual activity. By definition, it is the application of force by one person against the will and well-being of another. It's unilateral, and we need to do the best job that we can to talk about it that way. As a recent article in The Guardian said, whenever a woman accuses a man of abuse, there is an immediate chorus of victim blaming. The accuser is put under a microscope. So just no, I said accuser, not accused. The accuser is put under a microscope. Her actions are scrutinized. Her motivations are analyzed. A standard narrative often emerges that the woman is somehow responsible for what a man did to her. So I would like us to talk about this a little bit now. Does anybody have other examples of how language can make what should be unilateral look mutual, or make it look like the woman is somehow at least partly responsible for what's happened to her? Laura, do you have anything there in the chat?
Yeah, I do. There are some comments. Some women also freeze, so it can be an automatic submission to what is happening to them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it's okay if it sounds uncomfortable because it was uncomfortable for the victim.
That's a great comment. Thank you for that.
Women who have experienced, I believe that was meant to separate the woman from the experience. So the experience does not define who she is. It was the improved language that was, moved women from being an abused woman to a woman who's experiencing abuse.
That's a really important point, and I think it speaks to the bigger issue that our language is constantly evolving. I completely agree with that comment. And what I would like to challenge all of us to do is evolve it one step farther. We're still not making the woman defined solely by the fact that her partner has been abusive to her, but let's try to say, at least in some circumstances, not that she experienced family violence, but Sally's partner subjected her to family violence, or words to that effect.
There is one more comment. The suggestion that couples push each other's buttons.
Yeah, I really hate that phrase. In even reasonably healthy relationships, that may go on. If I'm having a really crappy day and I don't have patience for my partner, I may do something that I know is going to push his button. So then I've got an excuse to say, don't be such a dork. That's a lot different because my partner's not afraid of me. I'm not afraid of my partner, and I don't do it very often. But to talk about couples where they push each other's buttons when what's really happening is one person is engaging in a pattern of ongoing abusive and controlling behavior is completely inaccurate way of describing what happened.
Sometimes other women are the perpetrators of the victim blaming language, because if we can other the victim, then we feel safer from the possibility of experiencing abuse ourselves.
That's such an important point. Whoever made that, thank you very much for saying that. This comes up in so many different ways. So it certainly comes up in language, where we sort of dismiss, well, she asked for it one way or another. And then when I say that after reading a story, let's say about a woman in my community who's been sexually assaulted, it is exactly as you said, a way of thinking, well, I would never make that choice. I would never do that thing. Therefore, I'm safe from having to worry about being sexually assaulted, which of course is completely untrue. But in the moment, it can make us feel better. It's one of the interesting things I read, this is in a slightly different context, that I read about a number of years ago, again, related to sexual assault, that defense lawyers really like to have juries with women on them in sexual assault cases. And when I first read that, it was counterintuitive to me, because I was assuming that women on a sexual assault jury would be very sympathetic to the victim. But often they're not. In fact, usually they're not. I mean, let's face it, probably none of us would ever be picked for a jury, a sexual assault jury, once we told the judge what we do for work. So what tends to happen when women are on sexual assault juries is that in order to do exactly what that person commented just a minute ago, to separate themselves from thinking they could ever be the victim of a sexual assault, they look at the characteristics of the victim and say, well, that's not like me, or she must have caused this man to sexually assault her. Therefore, whew, I feel safer. It's not going to happen to me. So that whole victim blaming that can be done by women as well as by men, I think is a huge part of this conversation about language.
We do have 2 more comments.
Sure.
One thing I found frustrating is that people would often say there are 2 sides to the story, or it takes 2 or 3, or there are 3 sides, yours, his, and the truth. So frustrating when you're telling the truth and they are lying, and when you are the victim in the situation.
I completely agree with that. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay. She should have left the relationship earlier. She should have knew the signs of abuse. This frustrates me.
Yeah, she should have left earlier. Man, I hate it when I hear that. We're going to look at a little video clip towards the end of the presentation where one woman talks about why that question should never be asked of a woman who's been in a relationship where she was being abused.
Mm-hmm. And the last question, the last comment here is, there is a lot of reason why the individual will not leave.
So many reasons. We could spend the whole morning talking about those reasons. And often one of those reasons is it's actually safer for them to stay. And you'll hear more about that in the video clip we're going to look at later. I also made a little list of other examples of language that blame the victim inappropriately. Things like, she was drunk, or even he was drunk. Some women like it rough. Things just got out of hand. That's another one of my favorites. Look how she was dressed. And then people sometimes, and the media sometimes, talk about, in domestic violence or family violence situations, the children as the innocent victims, which of course they are. But often the way that sentence is used implies that the mothers are not innocent. And the mothers are innocent as well. I think there's still a bit of a societal attitude that if you're an adult, you should be able to protect yourself. And if you don't, then maybe it's not that bad. Maybe you don't mind it, and so on. So clearly lots of language that mutualizes responsibility for what's happened, just like there's lots of language that can paint a passive rather than an active picture. And unfortunately, all of that language has an impact on how, as a society, we think about gender-based violence and we think about responses to it. Language can also minimize what's happened. So here's just a couple of examples of that. Well, at least she wasn't hurt. Thank God it wasn't physical. Both of those statements minimize what's happened. The first, at least she wasn't hurt, usually means there were no physical injuries. Okay, that's great. Glad there were no physical injuries, but that does not mean the woman was not hurt. And as I think probably all of you know, most women who've been subjected to violence indicate that it's the verbal and the psychological abuse, the coercive control, that has the deepest and longest lasting impact on their well-being. I had clients often when I was still practicing law who would say to me, honestly, I just wish he would have hit me, because then I would have felt that I wasn't crazy. Then I would have understood that what was happening to me was wrong. I would have been able to explain it to my family so they would understand what was going on. As long as he was just verbal, as long as he didn't hurt me physically, it was more difficult for me to even understand what was happening to me. And it was certainly more difficult for me to make other people understand. So that statement, well, at least she wasn't hurt, just like thank God it wasn't physical, are highly problematic, and both of them minimize what's happened. We do the same when we talk about, I'm not saying, when I say we, I mean societally. I don't think any of us talk like this. When we describe sexual violence as groping, unwanted kissing, or fondling, When someone who is strangling their partner by putting their hands around their neck, when that action is described as squeezing rather than strangling. And when we call a relationship that is abusive high conflict, and we see this in family court all the time. It's a high conflict case. This is a high conflict family. There are high conflict families. They're a nightmare, for sure. But a high conflict family is one where, let's say it's me and my partner, we've split up, we're just complete jerks to each other, we're dragging the court proceedings on forever, we're fighting over stupid things. That's a high conflict family. That's a high conflict case. That doesn't mean there's abuse. I'm not afraid of my partner's not afraid of me. There's no coercive control. We're just treating each other really badly. That's different from a family law situation that involves family violence, that involves gender-based violence that's being perpetrated by one spouse, more commonly the male, against the female. Any other examples that people have of language that's used that you think minimizes the seriousness of what it is that's going on? Nothing there right now, Laura?
Nothing, no.
Okay. I'm going to just talk about a couple of other things. So till roughly 10:30, 10:35, and then we'll take a short break. How does that sound to everybody? As I said at the beginning, it's true. Women can be abusive to their male partners. And some people subjected to abuse are in same-sex relationships. However, the research is clear that in heterosexual relationships, the most serious forms of abuse, coercive control, physical violence that requires medical attention, abuse that causes fear, and domestic homicide, those forms of abuse are perpetrated overwhelmingly by men against women, something around 93%. So then why do we keep using gender neutral terms like family violence, which I've used several times this morning, domestic violence, intimate partner abuse? Maybe what we should be saying is violence against women within the family. It's long, it's clunky, but it does describe what we're talking about more accurately. Women who are subjected to gender-based violence are called a lot of different things. And by that, I don't mean bad names. I just mean labels that are given. And I struggle with this all the time. So I'm really going to be really interested to hear what your thoughts are about this. Do we call that woman a victim? It sounds vulnerable, which is how many women feel, particularly when they're still in the abusive relationship or involved in a system related to that. But other women say the word's disempowering, and they feel that it doesn't give them much agency. Should we call them survivor? That's certainly more empowering sounding. But is it how a woman feels when the abuser is still actively abusing her? Or when she's involved in a legal system that takes away her voice? Maybe not. Another term that comes up is complainant. That's really a criminal term that is used once she goes to the police. I've never liked this word because I think it makes it sound like she's just complaining about something, like, you know, I didn't like that dinner I had last night, or boy, this TV show was really crappy. So that's a way, in a way, further minimizes what's been done to her. I know it's just a legal term, it's just used in the criminal system, but I'd love to get rid of it. And then we have the word witness, which of course is the accurate word to describe the victim's role in the criminal process, but it's a pretty disempowering word too. And I think it comes, I know it comes as a shock to many women who are involved in a criminal proceeding, whether it's because their partner has been charged with something related to intimate partner abuse or whether it's a sexual assault case. Women are pretty surprised, not in a happy way, to realize that that's what they are. They're a witness. They're not the star of the show. They're not the center of the proceedings. They are there simply to tell the court what happened to them. So we've got these different words. Some of them make more sense in one context than in another. I'm especially interested in what your thoughts are about the words victim and survivor. Does anybody want to throw out some thoughts in the chat there? Which do you think is more appropriate? How do you decide what word to use when you're talking about a client?
There were one or two questions just about avoiding minimizing too. So maybe I'll go through those first, Pam.
Sure.
One of the comments is, I guess it wasn't that bad if she didn't leave. It's minimizing.
Yeah.
Somebody else said there was a recent case of intoxication being allowed to be used as a defense last year.
Is that the end of that comment?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, let me just say one thing about that, even though it's not so much about language. This whole issue of intoxication in the context of sexual violence in particular is so problematic because most of us would think that a woman who is intoxicated is not able to give meaningful consent, right? If I've had enough to drink that I'm pretty woozy and not really in control of what I'm thinking about, am I really consenting when this other person subjects me to sexual activity or sexual assault? I would argue no. The law really, it's a very fine line, and I understand the complexity of it, but it is an area that I think on the legal side, on the criminal law side, we really need to get a little more clarity.
Giving choice to the woman on how she wants to be perceived is important, and sometimes self-perception shifts and evolves as a woman moves through her journey.
That's a great comment. Thank you.
That's all for now. Oh, there is one more, sorry.
Yeah.
The language used when a husband sexually assaults his wife minimizes. I've seen it alluded that sexual violence does not exist in a marriage.
Yes, that's another really important point. We could also spend quite a long time talking about that. I'm old enough that 1983 doesn't seem really all that long ago. That's probably not true for all of you. Some of you might not have been born in 1983. But it was only in 1983 that it became against the law for a man to rape his wife. And I think many of the attitudes that existed prior to that still linger for women as well as for men. The idea that when you get married, sex is an expected part of what happens, and maybe you just don't really like it, but you put up with it. I mean, that's one thing. That's sad if that's how somebody feels about sex in their intimate relationship. But there's a difference for sure between not being, wildly excited about sex and situations where there's no consent for the sexual activity, what becomes a sexual assault to take place. But yeah, it's not really well understood. And any of you who work with women on the family law side are already going to be aware of the fact that very, very few of them will ever talk about sexual assault or sexual abuse in their relationship, even though it's not an uncommon element of a abuser's array of techniques that he's using, the tactics that he's using. Women are too embarrassed to talk about it. Okay, so let's look at one other word, or one. We've looked here at what words we should use or could use to talk about women who've been subjected to gender-based violence. But what about the person who's perpetrating that violence, who's causing that harm? Let's talk about this for a minute, and then at that point, we'll take a break. So he can be called the abuser, maybe, but that abuser is probably many other things too, not all of them bad. So just like we don't necessarily want to define the woman as an abused woman, do we want to call all those who engage in abusive behavior an abuser? I don't know. Perpetrator, I don't like that word unless I'm talking about something in the context of a criminal proceeding, because I think it really has a criminal tone to it. Nothing wrong with that. But if there isn't anything criminal going on, there's no charges been laid, etc., I'm not so comfortable with that word. Accused, of course, is only the term to be used if someone has been criminally charged, and offender only if he's been found guilty. Any of you have any great other terms or words that can be used to describe the person who's causing the harm?
There's one comment, Pam, about the language around victim or survivor. Victims acknowledge the lack of active participation. Oh, sorry, this just went up 1 second. Victims acknowledge the lack of participation in the abuse. Survivor may seem trite, especially to someone who is barely treading water. Neither are particularly accurate. We need a better word.
We so needed a better word. And I've also talked to women or listened to women who've said, I'm neither of those things. Like I was a victim, then I was a survivor, but I've moved on from that. And even to call me a survivor, which is empowering in some ways, makes me feel like you're limiting who I am to this one thing that happened to me. And I'm somebody different now. I'm not in a relationship where my partner's abusing me. I don't want to be a victim. I don't want to be a survivor. So yes, maybe we need to have a competition with a prize. What's the best word? But also, what's the best term when we're talking about the violence that women in relationships are subjected to, so that we can get away from domestic violence or intimate partner violence? That those terms don't really tell us a lot.
In regards to the person causing the harm, there's a comment, a person who uses abuse and violence in intimate partner violence.
Yep.
Um,
I think that's a good one. And the one I used in the headline, I think is also good. It's the same idea. It's just a bit shorter. The person who's caused the harm, the person causing harm to another person. Or maybe we just use people's names. What I think we need to stay away from, I'll just make this comment and then suggest we take the break. And then when we come back, I can pick up on any comments that are still hanging on.
Sure.
We want to stay away from language in the case of the person causing the harm that focuses on the other aspects of him. If this is a story, if we're telling a story, if we're speaking at a conference, if we're doing a media interview that's about, let's say, intimate partner violence, and we're talking about somebody, a particular situation, it's not helpful if we get distracted by thinking, oh yeah, but he's a great dad, right? Maybe, but do great dads really cause harm to the mother of those children? Oh, he'd been under a lot of pressure. That's a way of both minimizing what he did, but also taking responsibility away from him. It's not really him. It was the pressure he was under that made that happen. He must have just snapped. For me, that's kind of like, you know, they're always going back and forth with each other. Who really knows what went on? And likewise with the person who has been harmed, we can, if we do things like say, well, you know, she's got a lot of mental health problems, or she's been struggling with addiction for years, that takes away from our understanding that who cares about that? This other person caused this harm to her. So we get distracted sometimes when we start to look at other aspects of who these people are, from understanding that this is a unilateral situation of one person causing harm to another in the way that we talked about a little bit earlier this morning. So let's take a short break. It's 10:37. Do you think that 8 minutes is enough for you? So it lets you get up and stretch your legs, maybe refresh your coffee. And then we still got 45 minutes to go after that. So I'll be back at 10:45.
Okay, thanks.